Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of History Now, the Future, where we talk to interesting people about some of the most pressing issues of today, using history as our guide and the future as our destination. My name is Cory Bradford. You may know me as This is Cory from TikTok and other places on social media. And my guest today is also pretty popular on social media as well. He is a firefighter turned labor lawyer who's become extremely popular on social media for his videos that try to explain labor law and how workers can protect their rights in the workplace. And he also made a pretty high profile appearance on the Dr. Phil show.
Quiet quitting is just doing the job you were hired to do within the schedule you've been given to do it.
And we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. But I'm really happy to have him here. Attorney Ryan Stygar, thank you so much for being on the show. I really appreciate it.
Cory, thanks so much for having me, man. And I've been a huge fan of your history TikToks and everything you've been doing. We really clicked from the very beginning. So it's really nice to be back here with you again.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. I did a podcast about 2 years ago called Stitch This, which was about TikTok content creators, and you were one of my first guests. Yeah, you were one of my first guests on that podcast, and now you're one of my first guests on this new podcast. So I really appreciate it.
I love it, man. This is fun. It's a full circle moment.
Absolutely. So for some of the people who may not understand entirely what it is that you do, can you kind of explain what a labor lawyer is, how you got involved in that field, and how you sort of parlayed that into the content creation stuff you do on social media today?
Absolutely, man. So when people hear employment lawyer, they may not realize it. There's really two fields there. There's the corporate lawyers, the defense lawyers, the ones who represent corporations against workers. A great example would be if you see the National Labor Relations Board sues Starbucks for union busting. There's two kinds of employment lawyers in that case. There's Starbucks's lawyers, and then there's the workers' lawyers. I represent the workers, so I like to call myself a workers' rights attorney, so that when someone's looking for an employment lawyer, they know that I'm on the workers' side. So what does my day-to-day look like? Well, my job is to make sure that you get paid properly for all hours worked. Your rights to engage in concerted activities like union activities are respected, and if they're not respected, I hold the wrongdoers accountable. I protect people who've been abused, sexual harassment, discrimination, wrongful termination, retaliation. All of these are cases that my office handles. We also do class action litigation for large enterprises who consistently and systematically underpay workers. We hold those people accountable as well. And, the passion for all this, it really started in my early 20s. I was a firefighter before I was a lawyer. And for those who are familiar, firefighting is a very typical blue collar, it's a hardworking job. You're a team-oriented atmosphere. And a lot of us are unionized. I was in a firefighters union, and I was in a fire union at a time that was very difficult for firefighters. Our pay was very low. I was making about $16 an hour as a fully trained professional full-time firefighter, which, look, 16 an hour is nothing to sneeze at, but really didn't feel proportionate to the amount of risk and work we were asked to take on. We were chronically understaffed. Our engines were designed for 4 firefighters. They typically only had 2 on them. And I almost never got to go home because there was no relief. So I was dealing with chronic burnout, underpayment, difficult management, tough work conditions as a firefighter. And that planted a seed in my head. I was thinking of changing careers already. There were things I wanted out of life that fire couldn't give me. Case in point, being able to go home for a few days a week. That just wasn't happening at that time. But I realized that the law was a path to make life materially better for working people. And it wasn't until I got through law school that I found a way to actually make that happen. But that's where the seed got planted, and it's why I have such a soft spot for working class people. I get it. I really do. I know what it feels like to be working your ass off. And no matter how hard you work, the rent is harder to pay. Groceries are more expensive. You have to choose, okay, am I going to have meat this week, or am I going to fill up my gas tank? These are tough decisions that a lot of times policymakers, corporations especially, they just don't respect how hard that is. And that's why we get bullshit articles from Forbes that say things like, oh, Gen Z just doesn't work as hard as their parents. They're getting crushed on all sides. So where does this all come into how a workers' rights attorney operates? Fundamentally, my job is to make sure that when you're working a job, you are treated with dignity, respect, you're paid appropriately, and to the best of my ability, I really want the work you put in to create a proportionate financial outcome for you. That's what I do, Cory.
Well, it sounds like you're one of the good guys. That's essentially what it sounds
It's
like.
so funny you say that, because I went to the doctor a few weeks ago and he asked me what I do. I said, "Oh, I'm a workers' rights attorney." So, "Well, what's that?" And I told him basically what I told you. I represent sexual harassment victims, wage theft, all those things, and I help them get justice. He put in my medical record, lawyer, one of the good guys. Said, yes, my doctor likes me.
Yeah, because I think when people hear lawyer, and first of all, I'm really glad you pointed out the distinction between labor lawyers, that there are workers' rights lawyers, and then there are the labor lawyers who actually support the companies who are, being sued or involved in some type of lawsuit.
Sometimes we call those labor relations consultants. Watch out for those.
Yeah. So I'm glad you pointed out the distinction for anyone who may need an employment lawyer. But also, yeah, when we think of lawyers, sometimes we think of, shady people who may be, representing people who aren't, have the best intent. And so it is important to show that, hey, you're out there fighting for the working class, fighting for people just to have their basic rights respected while they're in the workplace, because we all have to work, and it is essential that those rights are being respected. I want to talk a little bit about unions, because you brought up that you were in a fire union when you was a firefighter. And 2 years ago, when we had our first conversation, it seemed like there was a major movement, especially among young people, when it comes to unions. There was a lot of unionization efforts going on in the country at that time. I remember Amazon was at the center of a lot of those unionization efforts in New York, because I was living in New York at the time, and there was a lot of talk about that. And it seems like in the last 2 years, some of that has contracted. It seems like we're not seeing as much forward progress with unions. An example, in my home state of Alabama, there was a Mercedes-Benz plant that recently tried to unionize, and the workers actually voted against having that union. Now, obviously, there were probably a lot of specific cases, involved in that vote. But when that vote failed, the Republican governor of Alabama praised the decision, was like, yes, this is the workers standing up for what they believe in. I'm sure if that vote had went in the other direction, there wouldn't have been as much praise for the outcome. But I'm curious what you think about the progress, or maybe some of the regression that you've seen in the last couple of years when it comes to unions, just in general.
That's a great question, Cory, and it comes from a few different angles. I'll try to touch on a high level on where some of this is happening. So I want to point out that even though, you could say progress has slowed, this is still one of the best times ever for union drives. We're seeing historic wins in the auto worker industry. The UAW, led by Shawn Fain, particularly is galvanizing workers in their industry and getting material gains for them. So we are seeing results. However, the Mercedes-Benz plant is an interesting case study in what I referred to earlier, labor relations consultants. There are firms that actually you can go find disclosures on the Office of Labor Management, olm.gov, and you can see who your employer is hiring and how much they are being paid as labor relations consultants. Now, what does that actually mean? Frankly, they're union busters. These are big multi-million-dollar firms, and their whole job is to go to quote unquote dumb, ignorant, naive workers. That's how they classify them. And pump them with disinformation campaigns. And this sounds like a conspiracy, but it's absolutely not. Just a few years ago, an Amazon Corporation training video was leaked and it went viral. You might have seen it. It kind of had like South Park animation. And it had a boss basically explaining what unions were to quote unquote dumb, naive new workers, and basically said, oh, a union is a middleman between you and management. They want to take your fees, and we're not anti-union, but we're not neutral either. It's all a campaign to convince workers that collective bargaining would somehow hurt their interests, which is insane. That is insane. That is an insane logical leap to make, that if the workers got together and bargained with their employer as a unified front, that somehow that would make their pay worse. And the typical criticism is, oh, you'll have to pay union dues. Listen, if you're paying $60 a month, I get it. It sucks. But if you get a raise, if you get more time off, if you get more benefits, a more favorable medical plan, all of these things for that $60 a month, it's a great investment. You're getting a better return on that investment than you would get putting it in the S&P 500 or the stocks.
Oh, yeah.
So I really want workers to see union dues as a sort of two-pronged test. First, look at it as an investment. You wouldn't criticize someone for investing in their 401k. You wouldn't criticize someone for investing in a portfolio. Why would you criticize someone for paying dues to an organization that gets you a 10% raise for the year?
Yeah.
So that's one way of looking at it. The other thing is to remember that your employer has a financial interest in workers being separated. They will say, we have an open door policy. If you have a problem, come straight to management. You don't need a middleman. You don't need some union getting between us. We'll talk to you. They're going to fucking fire you. Sorry, can I cuss on this podcast?
Oh, of course, yes. I mean, you've seen my videos, of course.
Yeah, they're going to fucking fire you. At best, they might harass you, intimidate you, bully you because you are isolated. You are alone. They have the superior bargaining position. They control the payroll. They have lawyers. They have pull in the industry. You do not want to negotiate one-on-one with one of the big three automakers. That's insanity. But when you unite everyone and say, all of us at this plant, all 5,000 of us have gotten together and we put together a list of how we expect this employment relationship to work. And if the employer says, well, we're not going to honor that, we'll say, okay, well, we're not going to build bumpers for a week. How does that sound? Suddenly you have bargaining power. But if you go by yourself and you say, I've worked here for 20 years, I've sacrificed everything, where's my raise? I can't afford rent. Your boss is going to look at you and say, well, you should have worked harder. You're a sucker. You're dumb. That's why you're in this position. It's horrifying and it's unfair, but that's why unions are good. Now, the counterpoint is, hey, there's bad unions. There's unions that have petty politics and they play favorites and they don't do their job. That is true. There are bad unions. And that's why it's so important to hold your union representatives and your union leaders accountable and participate in your union. You have to participate in your union or it's not going to be a good union. So that's a very long-winded way of the first prong, that there are organizations and companies whose whole job is to convince working class people that unions are bad. That's why whenever I post about unions, you'll see a bunch of comments from blue collar, middle, and lower class Americans saying unions are ruining this country. That's simply not true. It's objectively untrue. It's provably untrue. But they've been told that by companies in New York, in Chicago, in Los Angeles, whose whole job is to convince workers that unions are bad. Now, there's the second thing. Where is this regression coming from? A lot of challenges to anti-union activity go through administrative law, administrative procedures. They go up through the National Labor Relations Board, something like that. That is an agency that enforces the National Labor Relations Act. Its job is to make sure that your right to discuss pay and work conditions, to advocate for better work, is protected. Now, when a company like Starbucks summarily fires 7 workers because they've been caught saying, hey, let's form a union, would you guys like to learn more about our union? They can challenge that with the NLRB. That gets challenged as well and goes up through the actual court system. There's the administrative law that happens within these executive agencies, and then there's the actual courts with judges in robes, the sort of things that you might expect. Unfortunately, we have a very conservative Supreme Court. We have a number of very conservative federal judges, and it's very easy for activist organizations to simply form an LLC or a corporation in a district where they know there's a very conservative judge, even if they don't really work there. It will happen is you'll have organizations like the Heritage Foundation, people have heard about, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. These are very pro-business organizations. We'll see that straight up. Someone will found an LLC in a district where they know there's a conservative judge because their goal isn't, oh, I don't want fishermen to have to pay for an onboard observer to make sure they're not overfishing. Their goal is, I want to overturn the entire legal framework that's giving this agency the authority to tell businesses what to do. Now, that's an abstract way of referencing the Chevron deference ruling that went away a couple weeks ago. That came from a case called Loper Bright. And what's happened there is the authority of agencies to make rules and to enforce those rules is suddenly in serious jeopardy for the first time in 40 years. So the workers' rights movement has taken several body blows. There are probably going to be more to come, but the fight's not over. And fortunately, this is the full circle to your original question, what's going on with the regression and union progress? The fire, the energy, the passion, the awareness is there. Thank God for social media, because it is getting harder and harder for anti-union labor relations organizations to convince people who are paying attention that being in a union is bad, that the US Department of Labor is tyranny, that the NLRB is some horrible deep state conspiracy. It's not. These are safeguards to help you go home safe to work after a long day, to help make sure that the wage that you earn is enough to feed yourself. These are very basic protections that are under attack, but my prediction, Cory, is the workers' rights movement is going to take a couple of big losses over the next couple of years, but we're going to come back stronger than ever, because once working class Republicans see the hit to their quality of life, eventually they're not going to be able to blame the Department of Labor. They're not going to be able to blame Biden or Democrats, whoever. They're going to have to confront the reality that, hey, my employer is not going to give me anything simply because I deserve it.
Yeah.
Simply because I worked hard and I was loyal. I needed a union for that. But now, because of 6 conservative radicals on the Supreme Court, the NLRB may not have the power to help me with this anymore. So where do we go from here? I think that's going to be the tidal shift we see. So in the short term, I expect more pain. In the long term, I really do think the workers' rights movement is going to be stronger than ever.
Ryan, it is sad that that has to happen in the first place, that we have to go through that period of pain just for people to realize, hey, these people don't have your best interests in mind. They have the best interests of the corporations who pretty much own large portions of our government. And we've even, got evidence that a lot of people on the Supreme Court, or at least a couple of people on the Supreme Court, may even be receiving gifts and other things in order to push them towards making some of these
It's not
decisions.
May, it's for sure. We have pictures of Alito Thomas fishing with billionaires. We have pictures of Clarence Thomas on a freaking yacht with Harlan Crow. And then he's ruling on cases that are connected to Harlan Crow's business interests. Now, I mentioned Chevron deference and Loper Bright. The Donald Trump immunity case got a lot of attention.
Mhm.
To me, as a workers' rights advocate, Loper Bright was really the most devastating thing that the court did. That was pretty devastating, because now, instead of agencies with scientists, engineers, industry experts, people like me who know a whole lot about labor law and not much else, instead of someone like me who knows a lot about labor law, kind of filling in the gaps for Congress and figuring out, hey, when is your overtime obligation triggered? What is engaged to wait under the meaning of the act? Like, what do these things mean? And regulating them. Instead, those decisions now go to the sole discretion of a judge. And conservatives love that, because they've got a supermajority on the Supreme Court. But what they don't realize is you now have a much bigger government than you had originally. Whereas you had checks, balances, and sort of administrative law controlling the decisions administrative agencies would make. It takes years for OSHA to make a rule, with periods of public comment and opportunities to challenge it. Now a judge who has no expertise in your industry can now arbitrarily make a rule based on a Bible verse they like. It's a very dangerous situation that we're in. A great example of that, in one of the Supreme Court's opinions that came out the same day they overturned Chevron, Justice Gorsuch, he confused nitrogen oxide with nitrous oxide. Now, I don't know the difference between those things, but some very smart scientists pointed out one is a dangerous greenhouse gas. The other is laughing gas, like you get at the dentist office. And the Supreme Court's conservative bloc just proved the point of why Chevron deference was so important. You don't know the difference between these two chemicals. To you, oh, they start with an end and end with oxide. They're the same thing, right? You cannot regulate scientific, engineering, technical, industry details with Bible verses. And unfortunately, our Supreme Court currently has made it very clear that religious ideology and consolidated power in the judicial system is their goal. And what they're seeing is challenges to administrative law. You know, you might see a challenge to the National Labor Relations Act's concerted activities rule, saying that those are protected, and specifically that you have a right to discuss wages with coworkers. That's not in the statute, by the way. Congress never said that you have a right to discuss wages with your coworkers. What Congress said was, we are creating the National Labor Relations Board. We have created the National Labor Relations Act. We have left it intentionally vague in some places so that experts in the board can fill in those blanks in the industry situations where it is appropriate. Congress said, NLRB, please create the proper exceptions, create the proper regulations. We can't figure that out. We're Congress. We have to decide, you know, how much money to give the Pentagon and, you know, all these other things. You figure out those industry details we don't know. And that's what the NLRB has done for years. But now your right to discuss wages may go away, because now we have a system that didn't exist 3 weeks ago, where an organization who maybe went yachting with Justice Thomas can now form an LLC in a red district, challenge the National Labor Relations Act because they'll say, oh, you know, we had workers discussing wages and we got a citation, but now we think the NLRB doesn't have this authority. And it is very conceivable that can make it to this Supreme Court's conservative block now. And in a 6-3 decision, your right to discuss wages at work will go away. So that hasn't happened yet.
Yep.
And there's a chance it won't happen. But that is the, in my opinion, really bad possibility that's been opened up by overturning Chevron. And the conservative arguments that, oh, Chevron will just force Congress to write clear laws, those darn politicians making ambiguous laws, that's a Fox News talking point. The reality is some statutes are intentionally ambiguous because the legislature expects the executive branch to fill in those details using industry expertise. And that's a good thing. Ambiguity's got this negative connotation, but there are times where you want ambiguity, because ambiguity gives you flexibility to respond to specific industry needs in ways that the Congress just can't do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm glad you put it like that, because not enough people are talking about this overturning of Chevron deference, which, like you said, I think is one of the most disastrous decisions that we've seen at the Supreme Court level, probably since 2 years ago when they overturned Roe v. Wade. I'm curious because I saw a video you did where you talked about the fact that the Supreme Court refused to see a case that would have essentially challenged the existence of OSHA. What, in your opinion, would the working world look like if an organization like OSHA ceased to exist?
I think the world would look a lot like how it did in the late 1800s, where you have essentially industry towns exclusively controlled by mining corporations. People work and live there full time. Every moment of their life is controlled by this company. They get serious debilitating injuries and they're simply cast aside when that happens. Basic safety regulations at your job are not tyranny. I'm going to say that again. I doubt there's any conservatives who listen to this podcast because, you know, facts. But basic safety regulations at your job are not tyranny. Busting your ass at a company, getting your hand hacked off because they can't be bothered to buy a safety guard for a saw you work on, and then being cast aside into a country with no health care, that's fucking tyranny. That's scary. Now, OSHA, look, are they perfect? No. Are there capricious, ignorant, stupid OSHA people? Yes. Human beings are stupid and capricious and ignorant sometimes, and OSHA's full of human beings. You're going to get bad rules. And that's why we have public comment periods. That's why we have opportunities to challenge these rules. Like these aren't unchecked institutions just doing whatever they want all the time. There are safeguards in place. So here's what happened. With the overturning of Chevron, the Supreme Court conservative bloc really showed their hand. They don't want any administrative law. They want every minute detail of every statute Congress passes to go through the courts. This ultimately was a big power grab by the Supreme Court because they're saying, no, no, no. The EPA doesn't get to decide what chemicals are dangerous in water. We get to decide, which is pretty scary when Neil Gorsuch couldn't know which was a greenhouse gas and which was a medical gas. So he's going to now decide what kind of chemicals should and should not be in drinking water. It is an absurd ruling. I'm telling you, there is no serious legal scholar who supports this. Maybe some radicals at PragerU think it's cool because they don't really understand what they have just done. Now, we talked about what would happen if OSHA went away. It would be pretty bad, but we're going to get a sneak preview of what that world might look like now, because OSHA is attempting to implement a new heat safety standard. So OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, it was given its authority to create rules reasonably necessary and appropriate for workplace safety. This was in the 1970s. That's vague on purpose because Congress wanted OSHA to figure out, well, you know, a safety rule for a factory might be different than a safety rule for office workers. We'll get experts to figure that out. Well, they have a heat safety standard they're trying to have become law. They started this process way back in 2011. It is 2024. We're only now getting public comment on these. It takes time. What is that heat safety standard going to do? Generally, it's going to create obligations to provide rest breaks when it's very hot, obligations to provide water that's accessible. Technically, the sanitation standard covers that, but this will be a specific heat safety standard for water. It'll also create some data collection, like making sure you're measuring how hot it is in your warehouse, things like that. This is a good thing. Yeah. And it's not particularly expensive. Frankly, if you're a human being, you should be providing shade to outdoor workers to rest in occasionally. You should be providing water. Anyway, if you don't do that, you're kind of a monster. But now we have a rule. Because OSHA, to this point, doesn't have a standard heat safety rule. And why is this so important? Well, states like Texas and Florida have not only refused to enact a heat safety rule, not particularly crazy because, frankly, 45 US states do not have a heat safety rule. Only 5 have one at all. Oh, wow. It's a minority thing. There's not a lot of heat safety standards out there. But Florida and Texas are unique, and they went out of their way to not only not have those protections, but to ban, prohibit, preclude local governments from enacting their own heat safety standards. So the city of Dallas can't say, hey, we had a 110-degree day yesterday, and there's guys working on the highway. We should have a law that says every 60 minutes they get a 10-minute break in the shade so that they don't fucking die. Greg Abbott, in his infinite wisdom, decided that that was a rule like that would be tyranny, unconstitutional, woke. I don't know what his beef is with that. I try to be as scholarly and academic as I can because I don't want to lose credibility, but there's just some moves made in state governments that boggle the mind. Yeah. Where it really seems there is no good reason for you to ban these rules unless, one, you have a uniform standard that you're about to implement, which neither Texas nor Florida has. I would be completely singing a totally different tune if they were like, hey, we have a statewide heat safety standard, and it says, you know, when it's this many degrees out, you get a 10-minute break at these intervals, and here's the water standard, and here. They don't have that. All they did was prohibit other governments from trying to protect their own citizens. So one is left to think, well, obviously someone paid you. You got a donation from a big oil drilling company that doesn't want oil field workers taking breaks or doesn't want to have to provide water to these people. So you donated a bunch of money. Now, I don't know exactly what happened there, but it would be much more logical than, oh, Greg Abbott just hates working class people. I'm not ruling that out either. So I took a long tangent there. What's going to happen with OSHA? We have this new heat safety standard rule. It will be the first federal heat standard rule if it applies, but it will be challenged. Yeah. It will be challenged almost immediately. It will probably be challenged by a brand new LLC in a red district somewhere and will probably be designed to make its way before the Supreme Court. And with Chevron gone, the Supreme Court no longer has to give any deference to an industry expert. They don't have to listen to someone with 30 years of experience working in oil fields. They don't have to listen to someone who's worked in a warehouse and understands the mechanics of those machines. They are going to just talk to their billionaire buddies, or maybe reference the Bible, and decide that OSHA never had this authority. That is possible. Another possibility besides a legal challenge, frankly, Trump presidency, the first thing he's going to do is fire everyone in OSHA who he can fire. And he's going to replace them with loyalists who won't do anything. Or if they do anything, they'll probably enact regulations with the specific intent of having them challenged just to defang OSHA a bit more. So all of this sounds pretty hyperbolic. Saying that Roe v. Wade was in danger sounded hyperbolic 4 years ago.
Exactly.
I'm raising the alarm. I'm waving my blue pen here. I should find a red one. I'm raising the alarm. If you work for a living, basic rights that you took for granted are now up in the air. And we have judges who are not looking out for working class people's interests. We know that Thomas and Alito specifically are severely compromised by lavish vacations and gifts that they have received from wealthy donors. You really think that they're going to think, wow, gee, what's going to keep Cory alive in his factory today? Hey, what am I going to do to make sure Ryan gets home safe from work? No, they're thinking, wow, this guy was nice to me. He took me on a yacht in Thailand and he paid off my niece's tuition and he bought me a new RV. Yeah, I'll do what he wants. That's the situation we're in. So we're recording this on July 11th, 2024. I'm very happy that yesterday Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez introduced articles of impeachment against those justices, because you can't have such outrageous, naked, well-documented corruption and allow it to go on, because that's how you get absurd rulings. Absurd rulings like, oh, hey, maybe OSHA shouldn't be able to say that workers should provide water if it's hot at work. So the stakes are pretty high, Cory. And on that note, I'll kick it back to you. I don't want to be doom and gloom, but I hope people see the seriousness of this.
No, absolutely. And from a historical standpoint, I mean, there were time periods in this country, whether you look at, the corruption of the Warren G. Hart administration, the corruption of Nixon, where Congress said, doesn't matter if it's Republican or Democrat, we need to do something about this mass corruption. And unfortunately, because of how ideologically rigid everyone is in Congress these days, I think it's going to be difficult to actually do something about Thomas and Alito's behavior. But if this were any normal time period, it wouldn't matter what the composition of Congress was. There would be no scenario in which Supreme Court justices would be able to get away with that level of obvious and blatant corruption. It just wouldn't happen in any time.
Yeah. Well, the Supreme Court is unique in that it doesn't have an enforceable standard of ethics. It's lifetime appointments. It's a pretty rough situation.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And there's another point that you brought up that I think is worth talking about. Chevron deference was really a valuable tool. What the justices may not have realized, or maybe they did it intentionally, there is some concerning and credible information out there that the goal of the conservative bloc is to basically render the federal government completely inoperable, so that more power can be given to the courts and to the executive, with the immunity given to the executive, taking away the powers of executive agencies and resting them in judges. It seems like they're setting themselves up for an ultra concentrated government where there's basically the president and his hand-selected core of judicial activists, and they would run things. I think that's a distinct possibility, because with Chevron overturned, now all of these hundreds, if not thousands, of decisions being made every day that were handled by those agencies now fall on the courts. And it actually presents a serious risk of freezing the court system by overburdening them with hundreds and thousands of minute questions. How much tonnage of trout should be introduced into a given water basin to keep those populations stable? A fucking judge with no technical training is now going to make that decision. What constitutes on-call time for a lineman when they're called in for an emergency? What time should be compensated? What should not? Instead of having actual linemen making that decision, a judge will make that decision. And all of that is going to overburden the court system. Now, the obvious fix to that keeps being repeated on right-wing channels is Congress just needs to write more clear laws. Last Congress session was one of the least productive in our nation's history. The gridlock in Congress is some of the worst it's ever been. The Republican Party is engaged in some civil war with itself. The Democrats seem completely unaware of the risk being presented, and thank God for AOC, because I don't know what those other fools are doing.
Yeah.
So the risk we have here is Congress completely frozen by gridlock, unable to pass regulations, much less any quote unquote clear regulations. And then we have courts completely flooded and overburdened with minute administrative questions that they never would have had to deal with in the past. That's what the administrative bodies were doing. So we have that risk of a frozen legislature, completely overcrowded courts that'll probably cherry pick whatever issues are most important to whoever is president at that time. And then we have a president who's completely immune from any criminal acts so long as they are quote unquote official acts. And no, there is no definition for what an official act is. The conservative bloc kicked that down to the district court, probably waiting to see what they say so that they can cherry pick a definition that suits Donald Trump. It's bonkers. It's absolutely, we are not living in normal times, Cory. Frankly, if Donald Trump seizes power again, I might ask you to delete this and I might have to go into exile. It's crazy times we're living in. Fortunately, it's not too late. We can advocate for ourselves. We can learn the rights that we have while they're still in place. And if they change, I'll be at the front trying to help. And for the love of God, vote. And I don't care if Biden is old. I don't care if his brain isn't working quite right. I've got my concerns too. We absolutely cannot have Trump seize power. If he does, I'm telling you, everything from your basic right to earning overtime pay to getting justice if you're fired for signing up for a union, all of those things are at risk. And you're going to make less money than ever. Your working conditions are going to get worse. And you're not going to be able to blame Democrats anymore.
Yeah. And that's the last part is the biggest part. If they decide to go down this road and give this maniac power again, then they're going to have nobody to blame but that maniac and themselves for making that decision. And they won't be able to push it to Biden's feed or the Democrats or anything like that anymore. And so that's a very good point. And like I said, if he does come back to power, Canada's looking pretty nice this time of year.
I want to get farther away than Canada. I might go. I might put an ocean between me and that guy.
Yeah,
it's just a shame. And it was never really supposed to be this way. When the framers designed our government, they never wanted a situation where your quality of life is instantly impacted by whoever is the president. The president was really supposed to be the administrative assistant to the Congress. Congress makes the law and the president says, okay, you created a law. Now I'm going to figure out how to execute the law. Executive branch. I'm going to carry out your will. And that's what's been happening for decades. And it wasn't perfect, but it certainly worked to some extent.
Oh, yeah. The majority of presidents, especially in the 19th century, deferred to Congress. Congress had way more generalized power and concentrated power than the president. And that's the way they wanted it. It was smarter to have power invested in this group of people rather than a single individual, because the one thing that the founders were the most concerned about and most worried about was this idea of a king or a dictator, of someone of that nature rising up and taking control here, because that's exactly what they got away from under England. And so, yeah, it's just a really scary time period. But I am glad that there's people like you out there fighting for these workers' rights. I want to, for the last little portion here, talk a little bit about another instance in which you fought for workers' rights in a very public way, was when you went on Dr. Phil's show. For people who haven't seen it, the episode was about this concept of quiet quitting, which was a big thing about 2 years ago. We don't hear about it as much anymore, but I think it's still happening probably at a high rate. And the idea of quiet quitting is you're going to do the bare minimum of whatever your job requires you to do. You're not going to go above and beyond because there really isn't any financial or beneficial incentives to going above and beyond in most working environments. And you were defending this concept of quiet quitting. You faced a lot of pushback from some, I don't want to be disrespectful, but some kind of douchey people that were also on the same episode as you. What was your overall impression of just being on that show, that experience? I mean, you did an incredible job defending quiet quitting, but what was your overall impression of just that whole experience?
Great question, Cory. And I will say, I've actually been on Dr. Phil's show twice, both times to talk about quiet quitting, and lazy girl jobs was the topic of the second one with Gabrielle Judge, who coined the term. Yeah, my impressions are it's tough right now. We've got a letter, or not a letter, we've got a number drawn in the sand and two people standing on opposite sides of that number. And one side is saying it's a 6 and the other side is saying it's a 9, and they're just not getting through to each other.
Yeah.
There's been this feedback loop. So here's the way I see the issue. The fundamental social contract between worker and employer is breaking down. And there are a number of things causing it to break down. And I want to warn anyone listening, the more simple someone's idea of the problem is, the less likely they know what they're talking about. There are a lot of factors contributing to apathetic workers, to put it bluntly, workers who don't care about your corporate mission statement. They genuinely do not care if their employer makes money or loses money, as long as the paycheck comes in, because frankly, that paycheck is not enough. Homeowners insurance in some areas has doubled over the past 4 years. Rents have gone up 30%, I think, is the latest figure across all markets in the country. Some obviously more than others who may be skewing that data, but the facts are that rent is going up. We've got a trend online now where Gen Zers and millennials will post pictures of their grocery haul. No exaggeration, we are in a place in our society where having a full cart of groceries is a flex. You get street cred for having food. It's a tough time for American workers right now. And so when you have a person who is working hard, doing everything they think they're supposed to do, but every month their bank account is zero or overdrawn. They aren't taking lavish trips. They aren't buying Louis Vuitton. They're just trying to have meat, dairy, and vegetables every week. They're just trying to have a full tank of gas. They're just trying to have a 1-bedroom apartment reasonably close to their employer. They're not doing crazy things here. And then to have people from up top saying, oh, it's just hard because you're not working hard. Well, you just had the wrong major. Oh, well, you know, you're just entitled. You need to pay your dues. I don't think anyone's entitled for saying that if I work a full-time job, I should be able to afford food and shelter. We're not even asking for the stuff other countries have. We're not even asking for medical care at this point. We're just asking for food and shelter. So yeah, it's no surprise that if you pay your people like crap, if you treat them like you're better than them simply because they work for you, and if you do not give them any meaningful points of progress, no positive feedback, they're going to quit on you. They're going to do the bare minimum it takes not to get fired, and they're going to save their best efforts for moonlighting. They're going to drive for Uber after, they're going to get a second job, they're going to try to start an Etsy business, they're going to do something. And it's not because they're undedicated, unloyal, lazy, entitled. It's because they're trying to survive. If you took these people and you paid them well enough that they didn't have to worry about basic survival anymore, you'd probably get a much more motivated workforce. They'd be less stressed and they'd be less bitter. Instances of internal sabotage, employees just intentionally not doing things to mess with you a little bit. That goes away if they feel taken care of. No one sabotages an employer who they like. That just doesn't happen. So I do not believe for a minute that Gen Z is lazier than their parents were. I believe they have less reason to push the way their parents did. If you crank out a really hard year and you work your butt off and you get a performance review that says meet expectations and a 1.5% raise if you're lucky, that's not going to motivate you to bust your ass and forego certain social events and wake up early and stay in late. It's not enough. It's just like if someone is training for a sporting event and they're putting in all kinds of work in the gym and busting their ass, and they do their 100-yard dash and find that their time hasn't gotten any better. What motivation does that person to keep putting in all that hard work at the gym if it didn't pay off? They're going to find something else that yields the result. So fundamentally, there's two sides of the coin. This is why I mentioned the number in the sand. Employers are seeing apathetic, uncommitted workers, and they think, oh, that person's lazy, that person's bad. And workers are saying, you're paying me the same wage. You're taking any excuse not to pay me. You're giving me minimum wage or 50 cents an hour above minimum wage. You're constantly telling me how bad and lazy my generation is. And when I do step up and try, I get nothing. And you keep telling me, oh, I need to pay my dues and work hard. You don't care if I work hard. You only care that I work hard for you. That's the other thing. It's the selfishness that the workers are sick of. We have employers who think that hard work by itself is a virtue. Hard work has no inherent value. If you demand hard, backbreaking work from your minimum wage staff and then get irate when you don't get it, you're a bad leader. That's all there is to it, Cory. So, look, on the Dr. Phil show, I think I'm painted as, what have I been called in the comments? A communist, a socialist, a beta male, whatever the fuck that is. Weak. Clearly, this guy doesn't own a business. I do. I've owned one for a while. I've been an employer for a while. Okay. All those insults are people who simply do not understand. Hard work is valuable when it yields a result that is valuable. Everything else is just wasted effort. And if you create a workplace where all effort is wasted effort, then you're not going to get effort.
It's a weird mentality that I grew up around in working class places like Alabama, where it wasn't uncommon to see someone, be like, hey man, I just worked 80 hours this week. I just worked 90 hours this week. What did you do? And I'm like, why are you flexing about being exploited? Like, you didn't get a whole lot of extra money for doing that work. You spent an enormous amount of time away from your family and your friends. And how close are you to being rich? How close are you to true financial security because you worked 90 hours in a week where, it was near the holidays or something? Maybe you were at a factory or something and you worked all this extra hours. How close are you to having a life where you don't have to do that ever again? You're not. And it's this weird, it's a culture, I think, especially in working class areas and small towns, it's a culture that hard work itself is rewarding, even if you're not receiving any additional compensation or benefits from it. And that culture has been perpetuated by the people who own these businesses, and they reap all the benefits from that hard work while the workers really don't. So they have to sort of use this propaganda to brainwash them into thinking that, oh, you should just work hard because that's the American way and that's the way we do things. And yet people are seeing their wages, their quality of life, their health all decline because of this excessive work. And who's reaping all the benefits? The guy at the top who isn't working nearly as hard as the people toiling away in these factories.
Yeah, the myth that CEOs are paid in proportion to the value they bring, that needs to go away. Look, no disrespect to my friends, but I hang out with a lot of CEOs and business owners and founders. The richest one I know, I don't want to call him out, but he's on vacation right now. And the second richest one I know, also on vacation right now. They were on vacation 3 weeks ago.
Yeah.
And look, no disrespect to them at all. They're excellent practitioners. They've built businesses, but I just want to point out that your CEO is not working harder than you. In fact, they're working much less hard. That's why they fought so hard to get that job, or they were selected to do it because they're someone's special boy and it was politically convenient to put them in the CEO position. That happens a lot too. The mentality of I'm working harder than you, therefore I'm better than you. I think fundamentally it comes from a confusion of the difference between discipline and work ethic. You can have a very strong work ethic and be very disciplined and still be a quiet quitter. Because discipline, I think, is valuable in itself.
Yeah.
The discipline to do hard things, challenge yourself, get up out of bed and go to the gym in the morning, even when we really don't want to, eat that healthy food, even though the donut looks good. That's discipline, and discipline is inherently valuable. It makes your life better in the long run. It's that difference between deciding what you want most and what you want now. But hard work, not always good. It's just not. A truck sitting in the mud spinning its wheels is working hard, but it's going nowhere. And that's the distinction between discipline and hard work I want to point out. So sometimes what's happened when you get that old head blue collar guy, I pulled 90 hours last week. Look at this pussy. He only worked 40 hours. That's why I've got the big Chevy with the lift and he's just got a dinky little Toyota because he didn't work hard like a man. hung out with a lot of those guys when I was in fire. There's a lot of that. They've confused discipline and work. How do we fix that? I don't know. I find it's hard to teach people self-awareness and
Yeah.
empathy. It's hard to teach someone that just because someone looks different from you or talks different or has different values doesn't mean that they're a pussy or they're weak or they're a beta. Like, a person can be a very good person in ways that are very different from you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You know, you wouldn't compare an Olympic swimmer to an Olympic weightlifter. Both are elite athletes in their own field. Their bodies are going to look very different. And it would be foolish to say, oh, the big weightlifter, he sucks at swimming, therefore he sucks as a person. Oh, the swimmer, they suck at weightlifting, they suck. So to say an employee comes into my office and they're not motivated by pizza parties and free coffee and the occasional work retreat, well, that must be a bad person. It's no, you haven't found the things that motivate an individual. So yeah, man, it's a weird culture we see. I hope it goes away. I really do. I find generally unionized workers tend to be a little less obsessed with that sort of thing. Generally, there are exceptions. And I think that's because the distribution of reward is more fair in a unionized system. The opportunities to get overtime are distributed in a fair way. There's actually wage increases that are scheduled that come to people, and it tends to create a better work environment. When people are just isolated on their own, they think the only way they'll ever become a manager or get that raise is by showing, ooh, look, I'll work 100 hours a week and look how much harder I work than everyone else. I should get that promotion. It's they're uncomfortable and they're hoping that with a consistent long-term show of loyalty, they'll get to be in that management seat. And it's really sad. I get a lot of people coming to my office who get illegally fired or something happens, even after they've done that for years. And that's part of the reason I'm so opposed to that. Ooh, I'm going to do 100 hours a week to show the boss how dedicated I am so I can get that promotion. I'm telling you, man, whether or not you get illegally fired, it's got nothing to do with your work ethic. It really doesn't.
Yeah, that's really, I'm glad you pivoted there, because that's one of the last things I want to talk to you about real quick. I'll give you a quick anecdote. I had a friend who was working for a particular organization. They were a news organization, and someone got fired, and they approached this person and said, hey, we want you to pretty much take on the duties of this other person that just got fired, do all this extra work, basically do the work of 2 or 3 people. And my friend was like, yeah, I'll do that, but I'd like a little bit of a raise and maybe a change in job title. And I think that would be fair. And the job was like, no, we're not going to do either of those things. We're going to keep you at the same wage, and you're going to have the same title. You're just going to be expected to do all this extra work. So the friend essentially refused and said, I'm not going to be able to do that if there's no additional pay involved. So basically what happened was the company started icing this person out, leaving them off important emails, leaving them out of certain meetings, treating them differently. And this basically amounted to what is basically the opposite of quiet quitting, the concept of quiet firing. And what's even crazier is that the way this situation ended was, they worked for a news organization, so all these people had to pitch different ideas for different stories. So one day they were in like a Slack channel and they pitched an idea for the concept of quiet firing. This was back when quiet quitting was a big news story. And they said, well, no one's doing stories about quiet firing. So they literally laid out their bullet points and pitched, not even attacking the company they were working for, just saying, this is a concept that I see happening to some people. We should do a story on quiet firing. A few minutes after they put that in the Slack channel, they were removed from the Slack channel and immediately fired that day. And I mean, this person told me about all this and I couldn't believe it. I was just shocked by this whole story. So all that to say, is that something that you've seen maybe in some of the people that you've had to represent, this concept of quiet firing? How can an employee protect themselves, or what should an employee do if they feel like that's happening to them?
Okay, well, thanks for telling me that. It's outrageous and unfair. Unfortunately, it doesn't surprise me. I see that daily. I deal with a lot of consults, and that's a similar fact pattern. Now, I will say, you have no legal protection. If your employer eliminates 3 jobs and says, you're going to do the duties of all 3 of those people and you're not going to get a raise and you're not going to get a title change. And you say, wait, that's unfair. Can I have a raise, please? And the boss says, no, you're just fired now. There's no legal recourse for that. There's no law that says you must be paid in proportion to the duties that you perform. So in that situation, there's not a lot legally to do unless something else was happening. Now, what about if you have a legally protected activity and you feel yourself getting iced out? Well, that becomes a little more interesting. I think a great example I see a lot of is FMLA leave. If you have a qualifying medical condition or a sick relative, or you're pregnant, or you're a father and you have a new baby on the way, you can get 12 weeks of job protected leave to go deal with those major life events. Now, what I'll see is when you request the leave, suddenly they're not, answering your emails. They start pulling you out of important meetings. They don't even give you a decision on the leave. Sometimes they wait till you come back from the leave, and you just find you're getting pushed out to the fringes of your organization. If you see that happening, I think that a couple of things should happen. First, talk to a lawyer so that we can kind of understand the nuance of your situation and coach you on what your moves are. But complain to HR, because at this point, Donald Trump is not president yet, and Chevron deference hasn't had a chance to infect everything yet. So far, retaliation for requesting FMLA or returning shortly after is still illegal. So if you feel you're being retaliated against, a loss of work duties, loss of employment opportunities, harassment, report it to HR in writing, keep a copy of that email, maybe CC a personal email, okay? And if they still refuse to talk to an attorney, because what you've done at least is you've established, hey, I engaged in a protected activity. I took FMLA leave. I requested an accommodation for a disability, something like that. I have noticed that I am being denied work opportunities. That's an adverse employment action. And I've reported it to HR. That's someone who has a duty to take some kind of action here. So now not only do we have the protected activity, but we have a bona fide complaint of retaliation. So now if they actually pull the trigger and fire you, you've got a much stronger case for wrongful termination. But even if it doesn't go that far, you could still go to an attorney and say, hey, I'm being retaliated against. What are my options here? Not fun. A lot of times people come to me and they say, hey, is there a super secret way where I can anonymously report and they'll never know it was me, but I'll still get paid? Like, no, because who the hell will they make out the check to? That doesn't make sense. You have to communicate with HR. Yes, I know HR is not your friend. I say it all the time. They work for the company, not for you. But ultimately, you have to put the company on notice that something is happening. And do not trust that they're going to tell the truth. If they don't have an email time-stamped specifically saying, I am experiencing retaliation due to me taking FMLA leave. Since taking FMLA leave, I've been isolated from the following meetings. I've been removed from the following committees. I've been denied an opportunity to interview for promotion. You've just laid it out, the retaliatory conduct, because I swear, if you do not do that, HR is going to pretend that everything that's happening to you is because of your poor work performance, quote unquote.
Well, thank you so much, Ryan, for giving us that crucial information for any employee that may face that type of situation. I really want to thank you so much. This was a great conversation. There were a couple of other things that I wanted to talk about. I'll have to have you back on here in a few months, because there's always going to be so many issues dealing with labor. And obviously, even, maybe even next year, hopefully this election goes well. But if not, I'm sure you will every single day be dealing with some other issue in regards to workers' rights, because it sounds like there's going to be a major fight ahead, and you're going to be on the front lines. So I really just want to say I appreciate the work that you do. And I appreciate the fact that you talk about your work so much on social media, giving people that crucial information, because a lot of lawyers are very secretive about what they do. They want to, make sure that, hey, you got to pay me before I tell you anything, which I totally understand. That's their job. But putting yourself out there, putting this crucial information on social media is absolutely essential. And trust me, a lot of people, you have 1.8 million followers on TikTok alone. A lot of people really appreciate the work that you do. So I just want to thank you for that.
Hey, thank you so much, Cory. And likewise to you, man. I think especially in 2024, in today's political climate, it takes a lot of courage to step up and tell the truth about our history and tell the truth about current events. There's a lot of people hostile to it right now. But ultimately, look, we're not deep state conspiracists. We're not trying to take anyone's rights away. We're trying to give everyone a better life. And so thank you very much for having me on here.